So here we go. Ex Materia and the problem of evil. The ex materia viewpoint does not get rid of the problem of evil completely. However, by removing the baseless assumption of ex nihilo, we can at least begin to address the issue. Philosophically speaking, our position has improved. But you might say that removing ex nihilo theology from modern Judeo-Christian thought is easier said than done. So let's talk briefly about creeds. Educated believers will admit that creeds are man-made documents. They're not inspired by God, and they're only true inasmuch as they reflect what is taught in Scripture. Creeds are not authoritative in the sense that Scripture is authoritative. On the other hand, creeds are considered a useful measuring stick for orthodoxy. And if you're Catholic, something like ex nihilo doctrine is going to be more set in stone. Historically speaking, if you don't accept the creeds, then you can be considered a heretic or part of a cult. Many people look at me that way, but I've also found that there are many people who are open-minded. The reason I bring this up is because I began this video series by quoting one of the creeds of Christianity. However, through the presentations I gave, you can see that the doctrine of creation out of nothing may not reflect Scripture after all, and Scriptures appear to indicate that we do have free will. Now, there are many views concerning free will. There's libertarianism, determinism, compatibilism, and I have argued that none of these can exist when the traditional doctrines hold that God created us out of nothing and therefore created our characteristics, desires, attributes, and everything about us ex nihilo. Divine predetermination of our acts before we make them is simply not a plausible or acceptable view for free will. Understanding that some core part of our being has always existed opens up a reasonable case for free will. Many of the views of free will tend to depend on the assumptions made about the nature and extent of God's foreknowledge. There are varied interpretations of Scripture on this subject. Upon testing Abraham to see if he would sacrifice Isaac, God says, "Now I know that thou fearest God." So does that mean he didn't know before until he saw Abraham's heart at that moment? In Isaiah, it says that God declares the end from the beginning. Well, what about the little tiny details in between? Did he know that when I went into my pantry this morning, I would choose the Cocoa Puffs instead of the Cheerios? If so, then libertarian free will is out the window. Does it make sense in the Old Testament when God gets angry if he already knew beforehand what the children of Israel were going to do? Does it make sense for God to respond to our prayers? Consider the plea of Moses, where the text says that God repented of the punishment that he was going to enact upon the people. I think it's accurate to say that we don't know. We don't know the nature and extent of God's foreknowledge, and therefore we don't know exactly what kind of free will we have. But the Scriptures do seem to indicate that we can choose. In ex materia theology, God created everything out of something, not necessarily matter, but something, which I previously called potential. Some core part of each individual person existed, and perhaps some kind of free will existed in this environment as well. However, it is unclear how much awareness we had, or if we were able to do anything at all at this point. The idea is that God creates spiritual beings from the individuals in this potential by some unknown spiritual process. These spirits are then called the sons of God, the same that are mentioned in Job 38 and who shouted for joy at the foundation of the earth, the same who guarded the tree of life at the time of the fall of Adam in the Garden of Eden, and the same for Adam and Eve themselves, as well as all the spirits of everyone who ever lived. Again, it could be said that even though there was an element of free will before the creation of spirits, it did not have much meaning because only after their creation by God could the sons of God act out their wishes and actually do something. Were the spirits created one at a time, or did they have to come out of this potential all at once? It is very possible that time as we know it did not yet exist. Now, at what point does it become apparent which sons will be good and which sons will be bad? Lucifer appeared to have status as a son of the morning. In fact, the name indicates bringer of light, which sounds like a good thing. And what if God did know that Lucifer was going to rebel? It would be oppressive to take away his free will. The free will defense actually makes sense as long as you understand that God isn't creating these creatures out of his own mind or out of nothing. You see, God did not create the pride within Lucifer, which led him to believe he had superior knowledge and superior ways compared to the knowledge and ways of God. These flaws were uncreated and inherent characteristics to this individual. Therefore, God cannot be blamed. In Ex Materia theology, God did not create the spirit of Adam and the spirit of Eve to be without knowledge on purpose. Ignorance was our inherent condition. Being spiritually flawed, represented by one of the shades of gray here, is also an uncreated aspect of a core part of who we are from before our spiritual creation. We have our strengths and we have our weaknesses. Again, God is not culpable. In the story of Adam and Eve, who represent mankind, it shows that their eyes were opened to the knowledge of good and evil when entering mortality. The same is true for all of us who are born and grow up past the stage of innocence in childhood. Remember, God places a spirit within the body, but what is the nature of that spirit? It is an imperfect spirit, weak and without knowledge or experience. And when an imperfect spirit is faced with choices, not all of the choices will be morally correct due to the flaws inherent in that particular individual. Some spirits are better than others, but none of us are perfect, because none of us have a spirit which is naturally divine or absolutely pure. I may be jumping ahead here, but in Christianity, God is providing a way for this spirit to become purified. Even if you find yourself on the darker gray end of the scale here, hopefully during the course of our lives, we've moved further towards the purer end of the spectrum. So God puts our spirits to the test while we're in mortality. We are faced with appetites of the flesh, trials of hunger, pain, sickness, frustration, lust, and so forth. It is natural for an imperfect spirit to fall and be dominated by the flesh. Unfortunately, it gets ugly when left to our own devices. It is a goal to have the spirit overcome temptations while in the mortal body. I'm not saying that eating food, for example, is a sin, but there is a balanced and correct way to manage these things. The Bible speaks of the carnal mind, or the natural man. Here's my definition of the natural man. It is an imperfect spirit who is subject to the appetites of the flesh and who is absent of or in rejection of divine assistance. We also find ourselves outside of God's presence. This is in order to reveal our true character. Now, this is kind of interesting to think about. How do your children behave when they move out of your home to their own place, or when they go off to college? Are they still well behaved and responsible, while not directly under your authority and your watchful eye? How about this? Let's say one evening you go to a friend's house, and the door's unlocked, there's nobody home. Your friend's grandma left a bag of money on the table. You could leave, take that money with you, and nobody would ever know. What choice would you make? This is an interesting test of character. And these kinds of tests of character are happening every day in our lives and in our hearts and minds. I believe that this is one of the reasons why God doesn't fully reveal his existence to the whole world. It also helps explain why many people act out the evils that they do, because they think their sins will remain hidden.